Hello, welcome to Endemic Times. My name is Amira. This video is looking at Yemen, a country that has already been experiencing devastating issues from extreme poverty, extreme starvation, malnourishment, and death, especially in young kids. And the war in Ukraine is hitting Yemen even harder. This is a report by the UN of the repercussions of the war in Ukraine and how that is affecting nations like Yemen. This is part of a series of videos that I'm doing on the global food crisis, and there will be a link to that playlist at the end of the video. Yemen is now entering into its 8th year of conflict and war that brought a dire humanitarian situation to the country. Over 50% of Yemen's population cannot access food necessary for their survival, while poverty, hunger, and malnutrition are exacerbating due to the recurrent crises of the war, conflict conditions, COVID-19 pandemic, and the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, with its direct and indirect repercussions on the already dire nutritional and humanitarian situation in the country. The March 2022 pledging conference, Yemen received financial pledges of about 30% only out of the total humanitarian assistance required for 2022. Food insecurity and malnutrition have already reached alarming levels. This is mainly due in part to deteriorated local food production and agricultural assets and hiking food prices. Ukraine and Russia are two major producers of wheat, barley, and corn and account for an average combined share of 27% or 15% of the world's exports. Rising prices pose a major threat and may significantly increase the number of malnourished children. The threat is highest for the poorest countries with a large share of consumption from food imports. Estimates by the World Bank warn that for each 1% point increase in food prices, 10 million people are thrown into extreme poverty worldwide. The national average price of wheat in Yemen spiked in March 2022. The national average price of imported wheat grains jumped at the end of February 2022, an increase of about 8.3%, which was nearly 7.53% higher than it was at the end of December 2021. This means that it was around 5.4% higher than in December 2021, which was before the war. The minimum food needs for 1 month recorded an annual increase of 351% in Lebanon, followed by Syria at 97%, and then Yemen at 81%. These three food import-dependent countries have also recorded a sharp decline in the value of their currencies. This graph here shows how the wheat prices in Yemen are expected to surge between 40 and 50% compared to current levels. Here, Yemen's food imports account for 39% of total commodity imports, which is high compared to other MENA countries. This is why the cost of goods, the increase in oil costs, and the lack of ability for Ukraine to export its agriculture to these nations that are predominantly import-based for a lot of their basic necessities, this is going to cause a lot of instability, a lot of food insecurity. And as mentioned in my previous videos, this is going to have a systemic effect just on the overall cycle of disruption that's going to occur in these countries as these costs increase and the inability to get enough food and supplies to the people increases. All global economies are already seeing the extreme pinch when it comes to inflation and the rising costs. The Russian-Ukraine war is expected to push inflation up by 45% in 2022, and this is mainly due to hiking global oil and food prices. Given the fact that Yemen is largely dependent on food and non-food imports, this is going to have really serious, devastating effects to their country. Some of the major risks include inflationary pressures on the income available to Yemeni households, especially the poor, as spending on food accounts for nearly 90% of total living expenses, considering that Yemen imports 99% of its wheat, 95% of cooking oil, 100% of rice and sugar, and 70% of dairy products. So this is a country where all of the basic needs in food for people to keep them nourished are all dependent on imports at very, very high percentages. With the increase in costs, the limited access, and just general warring nations and tribes in these countries, this is going to have very serious effects to an already devastated region. In 2016, a UN assessment had shown that 9% of households in Yemen depend on overseas remittance as their income source. This means that millions of Yemenis depend on the funds transferred by their relatives. But with the spread of COVID-19 in 2020, the flow of remittance shrank by 70% due to lockdowns and other social distancing measures in host countries. And the effect of those lower remittance can be seen in this graph here in the change in household income in Yemen due to this drop in 2020 from 2019. With the share of food imports 4 times above the global average, this poses a serious risk to the national economy of Yemen. The poorest households represented by quintiles 1 and 2 are suffering severe income loss of approximately 21% over the year 2020, due mainly to their high income dependency on remittance. Higher income quintiles experience a less significant share of income loss, while absolute income losses are larger. Yemen is a country that needs a lot of humanitarian aid because of the countless issues that the country is facing. This graph here shows the evolution of funding and what the response plan looks like and what are the needs. The latest data published on April 21st of 2022 shows that the total funding reached 415.1 million. And while the funding outside the humanitarian response plan for the year of 2022 amounted to about 325.8 million. The funding available through the 2022 humanitarian response plan reached 89.3 million, which is equivalent to 2.1% of the total funding requirements, which is 4.3 billion, the lowest funding level for a humanitarian response plan in the world. So of all of the countries that need a lot of support, Yemen is definitely one of them. They have one of the most severe humanitarian issues going on in that country. And the fact that they are only getting 2.1% of their total funding requirements to deal with those issues really shows where Yemen is and where the global economy is as well, because this war in Ukraine is affecting so many different areas, and it's affecting the aid of other countries to be able to provide to countries like Yemen that are in desperate need. This is going to have very serious, devastating consequences to Yemen, and we are going to see more starvation, more malnourishment in little babies and children, and then sadly, a lot more death. This graph here shows the top 5 sources of humanitarian funding to Yemen as of May 6th of 2022. The United States and European countries are the most important funding sources for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It includes 60.3% from the US and 15.6% from the European Commission. And there's 5.9% from Germany, and 6% is from the rest of the European countries, in addition to Canada. So as our global markets and economies fall, the humanitarian aid necessary that we can provide to countries like Yemen is going to continue to decrease. And that has that really bad systemic and precipitating effect of just making a country that's already struggling struggle that much more. The risks associated with the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war on Yemen will trigger significant negative impacts on food security, nutrition, and humanitarian conditions. Food insecurity and acute malnutrition levels in Yemen have deteriorated further in 2022, with 17.4 million people in need of assistance as of March, and this number jumped to 19 million starting June to the end of the year. We're halfway through 2022. So this really shows the severity of the situation going on in Yemen that needs to be addressed, that needs to be discussed in mainstream media, because this is a really, really serious crisis. But unfortunately, again, the mainstream media is finding other things to talk about, not the suffering of millions of people. Of the greatest concern is that 31,000 people in March of 2022 faced severe hunger levels, and this figure will rise to 161,000 by June of 2022. In addition, 2.2 million children under the age of 5, including 538,000 severely malnourished, and about 1.3 million pregnant and lactating women are projected to suffer from acute malnutrition over the course of 2022. Severity level increases dramatically in the projection period for both insecurity and acute malnutrition, with 86 districts moving to higher IPC phases. And those IPC phases are looking at the different levels, with IPC 5 being catastrophe level. Sadly, there's not much to say looking at this information other than to just find it really devastating and sad, especially since there really isn't a lot of people talking about this. And this graph here shows the Yemen food insecurity over the last almost decade, since 2003, and the expected repercussions of the war in Ukraine. And this shows the severity of food security levels for the projected period ending in December of 2022 may increase by 60%. Food insecurity is expected to rise 3 to 5 percentage points to 63% during the second quarter of 2022, and this rate is expected to rise to nearly 65% by the end of 2022. Another factual risk is that of food insecurity and soaring food and energy prices due to the Russian-Ukrainian war, which could threaten peace building and undermining the truce and efforts to bring back stability in Yemen. History has repeatedly shown that political stability is affected by the extent to which people are able to buy food. There is a nuanced relationship between food insecurity and violence. Acute food insecurity can exacerbate conflict, and violent conflict itself is a major driver of acute food insecurity. So what that basically means is that both of these situations are devastating to Yemen. The conflict itself in Yemen that's causing food insecurity, and then the amplified effects of not being able to receive the necessary imports, and also their inability to get as much humanitarian aid from foreign nations that they normally get, is going to drive up food insecurity with already increased food prices. So this is just really bad systemic effects that are going to continue to have very devastating consequences to this region. Some of the recommendations and policy options that they discuss in this report are three in particular that I wanted to list here. And the first one is to scale up and expand support for the promotion of agricultural production, agro-livelihoods, and food security. The second is strengthening social protection across the humanitarian development nexus in Yemen. And third is to support and promote development and sustainable peace building processes in Yemen. So thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell. And this is all part of a series that I am working on to talk about the global food crisis and look at the different nations that are being seriously affected by this crisis. And you can check out that playlist right here. Stay safe, take care, and remember to be kind to each other.